3 days ago, a story emerged about Delene Baston, a woman who has dedicated decades to assisting those grappling with financial struggles. She manages a food support initiative, links families to essential services, and has devoted her career to guiding people through economic hardships. Yet, even she is now feeling the pressure as gas and grocery costs climb. Just 1 week ago, a nationwide survey revealed that over 50% of Americans reported that day-to-day life had become harder to afford compared to the previous year. Among them, 76% identified escalating grocery prices as their top concern, ranking even above gasoline and transportation, which concerned 71%, and surpassing worries about healthcare, housing, or other expenses. Yesterday, forecasts indicated that the Consumer Price Index for April is expected to rise by 0.6% month over month, marking the sharpest jump since March of 2022, largely fueled by surging energy costs linked to the Iran conflict. Analysts predict that the April CPI will likely exceed March's numbers. This is the unfolding story of what can be called the silent strain. It is silent not because it is unnoticed, but because it unfolds in ordinary, mundane settings, rather than on financial news stages. The burden shows up at the grocery checkout rather than the trading floor, at the gas station rather than in a central bank briefing, inside a household budget rather than in macroeconomic reports. These pressures are invisible to the headline inflation figures that economists track, yet they dominate the financial reality of the roughly 2/3 of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. The real arithmetic of groceries and gas is quietly eroding household accounts in May 2026, and the April CPI report is expected to confirm that this quiet erosion is intensifying rather than easing. Starting with groceries, this is the area Americans are most concerned about, as 76% identified it as the clearest threat to affordability. USDA data released 2 weeks ago provides a detailed breakdown, showing that food-at-home prices rose 1.9% over the 12 months ending in March 2026. At first glance, that figure seems moderate, falling below the long-term historical average. Month to month, prices were flat from February to March. These numbers have been cited as evidence that grocery inflation is under control. Yet a closer look at individual categories tells a different story. Beef prices surged 12.1% compared to March 2025, reflecting a 70-year low in the national cattle herd. Omaha Steaks' CEO noted that prices are unlikely to drop materially before late 2027. Coffee prices jumped roughly 19% year over year, while fresh vegetables are forecast to rise about 2% this year. Overall, the USDA projects that 7 out of 15 food-at-home categories will grow faster than their 20-year historical averages in 2026. Meanwhile, the average weekly grocery bill has climbed to $170, up from $120 in 2020, representing a 42% increase for a family of 4 shopping weekly. That means households are paying $2,600 more annually than in 2020, not because they're buying fancier items, but because the same groceries now carry higher prices. Stories from ordinary Americans highlight the human impact behind these numbers. One mother in Houston, working for a nonprofit, explained that the money that once filled her grocery cart now barely covers essentials. She hears that inflation is low but has no time to ponder it, too busy just trying to survive. Her experience exemplifies the gap between official statistics and the real-life impact felt at the kitchen table, showing that middle-income families are far more squeezed than headline figures suggest. Turning to gasoline, this is the second largest worry, affecting 71% of Americans. The conflict in Iran has transformed fuel from a flexible expense to one that is effectively fixed for many households, as meaningful reductions would require altering housing, employment, or the vehicle itself. The national average price for gasoline recently stood at $4.16 per gallon, a level confirmed to be straining households across the income spectrum. Since the Iran conflict began on February 28th, oil prices surged from $72 per barrel to over $112. The Strait of Hormuz has effectively remained closed for 71 days, and missile attacks earlier this week underscored that ceasefire agreements have not stabilized the situation. April's CPI is projected to increase by 0.6%, heavily driven by energy costs, translating to an annualized rate of about 7.2% for the month. The impact of gasoline on a household depends on factors like driving habits, vehicle efficiency, and local price differences. Baseline calculations show that a driver filling a 15-gallon tank twice weekly at pre-war prices of $3 per gallon spent $90 weekly. With prices now at $4.16 per gallon, that same driver pays roughly $124.80 weekly. Over a full year, the conflict has added approximately $1,768 in fuel costs for a household earning $60,000 annually, equating to nearly 3% of gross income, or about 4% of take-home pay after taxes. This extra spending does not go to savings, retirement contributions, or debt repayment. It simply transfers purchasing power from households to oil companies without any additional benefit to the family. Historically, the way grocery and energy inflation erodes household finances follows a four-stage pattern. The first stage is substitution, where families adjust to higher costs by swapping expensive items for cheaper alternatives, shifting from ground beef to chicken or plant-based proteins, choosing store brands over name brands, using coupons and loyalty programs, or consolidating trips to save on gas. This stage preserves budgets, but often at the expense of convenience, nutrition, quality, and time. Surveys indicate that nearly 90% of Americans are actively employing such strategies, with 30% paying closer attention to grocery prices and about 25% cutting non-essential purchases or switching to cheaper brands. Stage 2 is budget compression, occurring when substitution options have been exhausted. At this point, groceries and gas consume a fixed portion of income that cannot be reduced further without major sacrifices. Families that have already optimized every possible expense, switching to store brands, eliminating dining out, combining errands, cannot shrink grocery and fuel costs further without cutting food intake or driving less than necessary for work. At stage 2, the grocery and fuel expenses transform into an effectively fixed portion of the household budget, directly competing with credit card minimums, utility payments, and school supply costs for the same limited discretionary income. Stage 3 is what can be called buffer depletion. At this point, the elevated grocery and gas costs start drawing down the household's savings cushion. Each month that groceries run $50 above plan and gasoline costs $34 more weekly than last year chips away at the balance originally intended as an emergency fund. Data indicates that families struggling to meet their bills had only $2,336 in highly liquid assets, a decline of 27% over 16 months. That loss, measured in real dollars from an already modest starting point, defines stage 3. Month by month, the premium on food and energy erodes the financial buffer. Stage 4 is account depletion. When the buffer from stage 3 is gone, the household turns to credit cards at 21% annual percentage rate to cover the monthly grocery and fuel overage. At this APR, balances accumulate roughly 1.75% monthly. A yearly overage of $1,200, about $100 monthly, charged at 21% APR, grows to $1,452 over 12 months following the minimum payment schedule. The credit card, once the emergency fund, now produces interest that further tightens the household's spending capacity. This four-stage pattern is not hypothetical. Historical episodes illustrate precisely how groceries and energy costs have drained household accounts on a massive scale. The first example is the stagflation era from 1979 to 1981. Grocery prices jumped 12% in 1979. Gasoline costs doubled after the Iranian Revolution disrupted supply. Over roughly 24 months, the four-stage cycle unfolded. Stage 1, substitution, appeared in USDA dietary data as Americans cut back on red meat for the first time since the Great Depression. Stage 2, budget compression, showed up as a drop in non-essential retail spending. Stage 3, buffer depletion, was evident in the personal savings rate, falling from about 8% in 1978 to 6% in 1981. Stage 4, account depletion, manifested in rising credit card delinquencies and record personal bankruptcy filings in 1981, which held until the 2005 to 2008 consumer credit cycle surpassed them. Today, with USDA predicting 7 categories of food growing faster than historical averages and gasoline $1.25 above pre-war levels, the current situation closely mirrors that structural environment, verified and undeniable. The second example is 2022, the most recent precedent. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, oil surged to $130 per barrel. Grocery inflation hit 9.9%, the highest food-at-home increase since 1979. The four-stage cycle compressed into roughly 6 months. Households maintaining thin positive monthly budgets after the pandemic shifted from stage 1, substitution, to stage 3, buffer depletion, within 2 to 3 months as food and fuel costs spiked simultaneously. Personal savings, bolstered by pandemic stimulus in 2020 and 2021, were rapidly consumed. By the fourth quarter of 2022, credit card delinquency rates began rising, eventually reaching levels unseen since 2021. The lesson for 2026 is the pace at which the four-stage process accelerates when food and fuel inflation strike together. With beef up 12%, coffee up 19%, and gasoline roughly 40% higher than pre-war levels, the situation structurally resembles 2022, when 9.9% food inflation coincided with the oil surge. If the same rapid compression occurs, stage 4, account depletion, could hit the most financially fragile households by late summer 2026. The third example is the human story captured 3 days ago. Delene Baston, who has spent decades aiding families in financial hardship, now faces the strain of rising gas and grocery prices herself. She assists households from a position of professional knowledge and personal financial stability that most of those she supports do not possess. If even someone with her expertise and stability feels this pressure, the situation for the 45 million Americans consistently struggling to pay monthly bills, as documented, is stark. It is tangible evidence that Stage 3 and Stage 4 are already in motion for a large portion of U.S. households today. It is essential to grasp the precise arithmetic of this erosion. Category-level USDA forecasts, Bloomberg's April CPI projections, Deline-Baston's experience, and buffer depletion statistics together form a complete picture of what can be called the silent ruin. This moment calls for awareness. Tuesday's April CPI report represents the next milestone in this unfolding process. The forecast of 0.6% month-over-month indicates that April may exceed March's already alarming reading. Confirmation would mark the fourth consecutive month of above-target consumer price growth and eliminate any remaining likelihood of a Federal Reserve rate cut before September. There are specific actions to interrupt the four-stage cycle. The first is a grocery arithmetic review. For households in Stage 1 or Stage 2, examining category-level spending is the most immediate and practical budget intervention. The USDA's 2026 forecasts identify proteins and beverages as the most inflationary categories. Beef up 12%, coffee up 19%. A household that has not yet analyzed its grocery categories can save roughly $25 to $40 monthly by substituting beef with chicken or plant-based proteins for 2 meals per week. Switching from branded coffee to store brand or bulk purchases can save another $15 to $25 monthly. Combined, these substitutions free up approximately $42 to $65 monthly, which can be redirected to cover credit card minimum payments, employing the fixed payment strategy outlined in prior guidance. This review does not require a financial advisor, only 10 minutes to compare USDA category forecasts to current spending, with the data publicly available online at URS.gov. The second intervention is gas cost minimization. Analysis indicates 3 practical approaches. Loyalty programs at grocery-linked fuel stations, such as Kroger, Albertsons, and Safeway, reward points that reduce per-gallon prices, with 100 points equaling 10 cents off per gallon. A household earning 100 points weekly through routine grocery purchases at these chains can save approximately $100 to $200 annually on fuel. Combined with maintaining correct tire pressure, which boosts fuel efficiency by roughly 3%, and lowering highway speed from 75 to 65 miles per hour, which improves fuel economy by about 15%, these actions create gas savings without altering daily routines or vehicles. For the average driver, applying these steps can cut the annual gasoline overage caused by the Iran war's price shock by $400 to $600. The third action is the preemptive review ahead of April's CPI release. Bloomberg's consensus projects a 0.6% month-over-month increase, signaling that the trajectory of grocery and energy inflation influenced by the Iran war's second quarter impact has yet to peak. The actionable step before Tuesday's report is to examine your monthly budget now and decide which discretionary spending category you would trim if April CPI confirms the forecast, and the Federal Reserve signals rate cuts remain more than 3 months away. Making this choice today, rather than reacting under pressure after the release, preserves both control and financial margin that reactive decision-making would otherwise eliminate. The April CPI report arriving Tuesday is particularly critical because the timing and makeup of the data have a unique impact on household budgets. Bloomberg's forecast of 0.6% monthly CPI for April represents the first full month capturing the Iran war oil shock at its most acute phase. March CPI reflected only the initial surge, while April will incorporate the sustained elevated energy prices that persisted through the month, amplified by the closure of Hormuz and the April 13th blockade, replacing the prior ceasefire framework in U.S.-Iran naval relations. The components of April CPI each affect household finances in distinct ways. First, gasoline. National averages hit $4.16 per gallon in March and remained elevated through April as the blockade kept crude above $100 per barrel. The Bureau of Labor Statistics' gasoline component will fully capture the month-long period in which millions of American commuters faced prices above $4. Second, groceries. USDA data for March showed flat month-over-month prices for food at home, but tariffs on steel and aluminum packaging combined with energy cost pass-throughs are building pressure along the food supply chain. April's food at home component could reveal the first significant acceleration in grocery inflation since the Iran war began, following a typical energy pass-through timeline of 62 to 90 days from the original price spike. Third, services. Core services, excluding housing, the Federal Reserve's most closely watched inflation category, has remained consistently above target through the post-pandemic period. This component reflects wage costs in the service sector. With the University of Michigan's consumer inflation expectations at 4.8%, service sector wage negotiations in April are incorporating expected inflation rather than the Fed's target, locking higher costs into the economy. Fourth, shelter, representing roughly 35% of the CPI basket, has been running at approximately 3.6% annual inflation, well above the Fed's 2% target. The convergence of these four components, elevated gasoline from the oil shock, mounting grocery inflation from tariff and energy cost pass-throughs, persistent core services, inflation from wage dynamics, and above-target shelter costs, explains Bloomberg's 0.6% monthly forecast. If confirmed, this rate eliminates any chance of a Fed rate cut in June, removes September from the baseline, and pushes the first expected reduction to the fourth quarter of 2026 at the earliest. Each month without a rate cut means 30-year treasuries remain above 5%, mortgage rates stay above 6.5%, and credit card balances used to bridge the grocery and gas gap continue compounding at 21% APR. April. CPI is not abstract. It determines how many additional months households in Stage 3 and Stage 4 will endure the silent ruin before monetary relief arrives. Bloomberg's projection suggests the progression is accelerating, not slowing. One more dimension magnifies the alarm for households. Official CPI measures systematically understate the true burden. They track price changes for a fixed basket but fail to capture time, effort, and opportunity costs of household adaptations. When a family shifts from ground beef to chicken due to the 12% beef price increase, CPI records a smaller price rise, but the family consumes a protein they prefer less. That lost satisfaction is real economic harm unaccounted for in official numbers. Similarly, when errands are consolidated, routes optimized, and gas prices checked across multiple stations, the time invested is real time diverted from other activities, consumed entirely by inflation management. Stanford professor Neil Mahoney highlighted this in Bloomberg's cost of living analysis, emphasizing that the unseen time and effort needed to chase deals and manage finances is central to the affordability challenge, yet absent from headline data. This unmeasured effort hits paycheck-to-paycheck households hardest, those juggling multiple jobs, childcare, and the intensive administrative burden of financial scarcity work invisible to official statistics. The silent ruin persists quietly because its most pervasive costs are too mundane, too personal to register in formal numbers. The Christian Science Monitor's May 3rd analysis confirmed that 62% of consumers surveyed by FMI reported feeling very or extremely concerned about rising prices, even after food inflation slowed from its 2022 peak. This concern is rational. The cumulative grocery price increase from $120 per week in 2020 to $170 per week in 2026 represents a 42% rise over 6 years, unmatched by median household wage growth. The gap between actual grocery costs and what they would have been at the pre-pandemic historical average of 2.6% annual growth represents the silent ruin's specific dollar impact for every grocery shopping household. Multiplying that gap across all American households quantifies the economic damage unreflected in any single inflation measure but recorded in every grocery store, gas pump, and credit card statement in real time. This channel identifies, analyzes, and connects that gap to the policy choices and structural conditions perpetuating it. Tuesday's CPI will reveal how much wider this gap has grown in April and what it means for households navigating the ongoing silent ruin. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.